Berlin, April 1945. The city was no longer a capital. It was a scar. The streets that once echoed with marching boots and proud songs now groaned beneath rubble and silence. Smoke hung low in the sky, as if the heavens themselves had been burned. For Hauptmann Karl Adler, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, the air was both his refuge and his prison. He had been recalled from the Western Front 3 weeks ago. The front no longer existed. There was only Berlin now, the last stand, the last breath of a dying empire. The hangar doors at Tempelhof Airfield creaked open in the gray dawn. Only 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s remained operational. Once, the airfield had been the pride of the Reich, a place where aces celebrated their victories and new recruits dreamed of glory. Now, it was little more than a graveyard of metal and oil. Karl walked slowly, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He passed by the wrecks of planes stripped for parts, the skeletons of wings jutting out like broken ribs. Inside the cockpit, the smell of fuel and dust mixed with the faint scent of burnt rubber. Karl adjusted his goggles, his fingers trembling slightly. He was 32, an old man by Luftwaffe standards, and he had seen too many friends vanish into the sky. He had fought over the Channel, over Stalingrad, over Normandy. Each sky had taken something from him until only duty remained. Adler, called Oberlieutenant Weiss, his commanding officer. You'll patrol the north sector again. Soviet scouts reported near the Spree. We can't let them advance unchecked. Karl nodded. With respect, sir. With 3 planes? Weiss forced a faint smile. 3 is more than nothing. The Reich is still standing. Karl wanted to believe him, but as he looked around, at the cratered runway, the smoldering hangars, and the gray, exhausted faces of the mechanics, he knew that was a lie. The Reich wasn't standing. It was kneeling, waiting for the final blow. As the engine roared to life, the vibration ran through his bones. The sky, though filled with smoke, was his only solace. He lifted off, rising above the ruins of Berlin. From the air he could see the once great city, now a patchwork of fire and ash. Columns of refugees moved like gray ants along the roads. Bombed-out trams lay twisted on their sides. The Spree River reflected only flames.
He flew low over the Tiergarten, where tanks lay abandoned like sleeping beasts. Somewhere beneath the trees, soldiers dug trenches that would soon become graves. His radio crackled with static. Eagle 1 to command, Karl said. No visual on enemy aircraft. Visibility poor. Copy that, came Weiss's voice. Stay alert, they're coming. The Russians? The end, Weiss said quietly, and then the line went dead. For a moment, Karl circled above the city in silence. He thought of his wife, Anna, who had fled to Bavaria the previous winter. Her last letter was dated February, before the post collapsed. She had written, "Don't be a hero. Come home when this madness ends." He had folded that letter and tucked it into his flight jacket, close to his heart. He touched the pocket now. Suddenly, he saw movement below, black dots rising from the eastern horizon, Soviet Yak fighters glinting faintly in the smoky light. His heart quickened. He rolled his Messerschmitt into a dive, his reflexes automatic, honed by years of battle. The first burst of gunfire tore through the air. Tracers streaked past his canopy. He fired back, the machine gun vibrating violently. One of the Yaks spiraled down, trailing smoke. For a moment, victory flickered in his chest, a familiar, hollow satisfaction. Then another enemy appeared on his tail. The sky erupted into chaos. Bullets punched holes through his wings. Oil splattered the glass. Damn it! Karl shouted, banking hard to the right. He flew between the ruins of buildings, skimming rooftops. The yak pursued him relentlessly. A shell exploded nearby, shaking his aircraft. Brick and debris rained upward in slow motion. He saw a church tower collapsing in the distance, its bell ringing one last time before silence. He pulled up sharply, barely clearing a burning chimney. The yak overshot him. Karl seized the moment, lined up the target, and fired. The enemy burst into flames, disintegrating into the haze. For a moment, only the sound of his own breathing filled the cockpit. He was alive. Again. Landing back at Tempelhof, his plane's fuselage riddled with holes, Karl stepped out and looked around. The mechanics stared silently, their faces streaked with soot. Weiss approached him, a cigarette trembling in his lips. "You got 2 of them?" Karl nodded. 2, but they'll be back. 10 more, 20 more. Weiss exhaled. "Then we'll fight again." Karl glanced at the horizon. Smoke rose endlessly. Somewhere in that gray expanse artillery thundered. The Red Army was closing in. "What happens when they reach Berlin?" he asked. Weiss didn't answer. He looked away toward the city. "Then Berlin will fall, but we won't."
That night, Karl sat in the dark barracks, writing in his logbook by candlelight. He wrote not for command, not for the Reich, but for himself, to make sense of what was left. April 17, 1945. Flew 2 sorties. Destroyed 2 enemy aircraft. Berlin burns. The sky is dying. He paused, then added softly, "I no longer know what I'm fighting for." Outside, the thunder of distant artillery grew louder. The ground shook. The candle flickered. He closed his eyes and imagined the sky before the war. Blue, endless, full of possibility. When morning came, orders arrived. All remaining pilots to prepare for evacuation of non-essential personnel. Commanders to remain. Weiss handed Karl the paper. "They're evacuating some of the ground crew. You should go with them." Karl stared at him. "And leave you here?" Weiss said, "Someone has to defend the city, but you've done enough. Go." Karl folded the paper. "If I leave now, who flies tomorrow?" Weiss sighed. "Tomorrow may never come." But Karl stayed, not out of loyalty, that had burned away long ago, but because he couldn't leave the sky. It was the only thing he still understood. The next day, Soviet artillery shells struck Tempelhof. Planes exploded on the ground. The hangar roof collapsed. Karl ran through the smoke, searching for survivors. He found Weiss pinned under debris, blood pooling around his leg.
"Leave me," Weiss gasped. "Get to your plane." Karl shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." Weiss grabbed his sleeve. "Don't waste your life, Adler. You're the last one. Fly." Karl hesitated, then saluted silently and ran to his Messerschmitt, the last operational fighter at the airfield. Flames rose around him as he climbed into the cockpit. The engine sputtered, but caught. He took off through smoke and fire, rising once more into the gray heavens over Berlin. Below, the city was a sea of destruction. Tanks rolled through the streets. Soviet columns advanced from the east. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the sky. Karl banked over the Reichstag, its dome shattered, its flag torn. He saw soldiers fighting in the streets, civilians running with buckets of water, children crying amid ruins. He wanted to scream, to stop it all, but the war had devoured every voice. Then his radio crackled. A voice, faint, broken, came through. "To all Luftwaffe pilots, this is General Kohler. The Führer commands that Berlin must not surrender. Repeat, fight to the last bullet. Karl switched off the radio. He looked down at the chaos below and whispered, "The last bullet won't change anything." He turned westward, climbing higher. For a moment he broke through the smoke and saw the sun, pale and cold. It reminded him of Anna's smile, of mountains, of home. He thought of turning the plane toward Bavaria, of leaving the ruins behind. But then he looked back at the dying city that had once been his world, and knew he couldn't. Not yet. The sky still needed one more flight.
The days blurred together after that flight. The smoke over Berlin never lifted. It hung like a heavy curtain, blotting out the sun, turning every hour into twilight. The air smelled of ash and oil, and something else, despair. At Tempelhof, there were no more orders, no more structure. Men wandered the airfield like ghosts, waiting for commands that would never come. Karl slept in the cockpit of his plane, the only place that still felt real. The Messerschmitt had become his world, his confessional, his coffin. He would sit inside for hours, staring at the cracked instrument panel, tracing his finger over the bullet holes in the glass. Each one was a reminder that he was still alive when he shouldn't be. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he could hear the city screaming. On April 24th, the Soviets surrounded Berlin completely. Artillery fire rained day and night. The ground shook like an earthquake, and the sky burned red. Karl watched from above during his patrols, if they could even be called that anymore. There were no commands, no tactics, just flying, circling, surviving. He saw columns of refugees crushed between tanks, churches on fire, hospitals reduced to rubble. He saw the Spree River clogged with wreckage and corpses. Each day the city shrank. Each night the fires grew. Weiss was gone. Karl never saw him again after that morning. The next time he passed by the command building, it was a pile of smoking bricks. He didn't look for bodies. He couldn't. On April 26th, Karl received a transmission. Weak, distorted, but unmistakably human. To Luftwaffe Command, this is General Ritter. All remaining aircraft ordered to relocate to the south. Repeat, withdraw to Bavaria.
Karl turned the dial, listening. Static swallowed the voice. Withdraw? To Bavaria? Home. The word flickered like a distant light in his mind. But when he looked out across the airfield, there was nowhere left to go. The runway was cratered. The fuel reserves had been destroyed 2 nights earlier by shell fire. He sat back in his seat and stared at the horizon. The city was dying, and he was trapped with it. That evening, he wandered through the ruins of the hangar, searching for anything that might make the plane fly one more day. He found an old mechanic named Franz, his uniform stained with grease and blood. "You still here?" Franz asked, coughing from the smoke. Karl nodded. "There's nowhere else." Franz lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You could have left days ago. The ones with rank, they're gone. You don't owe them anything." Karl looked up at the gray sky through the shattered roof. "Maybe not, but I owe the sky something." Franz stared at him for a long time, then smiled weakly. "You pilots, always chasing ghosts." The next morning, Karl took off again. He had barely enough fuel for 1 hour of flight, but he needed to see it, to witness what remained. He climbed above the smoke and leveled out at 2,000 meters. Below him, Berlin looked like the surface of another planet. Black craters, gray dust, fire crawling through the ruins.
Then, Movement. Tiny flashes to the east. Soviet planes again. This time IL-2 Stormoviks, flying low and slow, bombing the last German positions. Karl pushed the throttle forward, feeling the engine protest. The Messerschmitt responded with a strained growl. He dove into the chaos. He fired short bursts, striking one of the Soviet bombers. It erupted in a plume of fire, pieces scattering across rooftops. Another turned toward him, guns blazing. Tracers stitched the air. Karl rolled, dove, climbed. His body moved without thought, years of instinct. He became the machine, and the machine became him. But there were too many. 5, 6, maybe more. They surrounded him, closing in. Bullets ripped through the fuselage. His left wing caught fire. He pulled into a desperate climb, the world spinning. His breath came in gasps. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Silence. The plane began to fall. For a moment, Karl saw everything. The endless city of ruins, the smoke rising in pillars, the red flashes of artillery, the black ribbon of the Spree, the skeletal towers of what had once been home. And through it all, the faint sound of a piano, or maybe just his mind playing tricks. He remembered Anna's hands on the keys, playing Schumann in their apartment before the war. He tried to level the plane. The controls were unresponsive. Fire licked through the cockpit. The ground rushed up to meet him. He closed his eyes. Impact.
But not death. When he awoke, he was lying in a field of debris. His head throbbed. His right arm burned. The Messerschmitt lay twisted beside him, its wings torn away. Smoke rose from the wreckage. He coughed, tasting blood. Somehow, he had survived. Again. He stumbled toward the city, following the sound of distant gunfire. The streets were filled with rubble and bodies. Civilians huddled in basements, their faces pale and hollow. A child stared at him, clutching a wooden toy plane. Karl knelt down and looked into the boy's eyes. They were gray, just like the sky. "Go home," Karl said softly, though he knew there was no home left. He found shelter in an abandoned cafe near Alexanderplatz. The sign outside still read Kaffee House Linden, though the windows were shattered and the interior was black with soot. Inside, a handful of civilians whispered in the dark. An old woman offered him a cup of water. "Your Luftwaffe?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled faintly. "Then maybe the angels still watch us." Karl almost laughed. "No angels left in Berlin, Frau." She crossed herself anyway. "Then God help us all." That night, the city shook with artillery. The Soviets were inside Berlin. You could hear their tanks in the streets, the screams, the gunfire. Karl sat against the wall, clutching his pistol. He had one bullet left. For a long time he stared at it, turning it over in his hand.
He thought of Anna, of mountains and blue skies, of how she would have hated what he had become. He pressed the barrel against his temple, then stopped. Outside, the sound of engines. Not tanks, planes. He stepped into the street and looked up. Dozens of Soviet bombers passed overhead, heading west. The night sky was alive with light. For a moment, it looked almost beautiful. He lowered the gun. "Not tonight," he whispered. At dawn, the Red Army entered Alexanderplatz. Karl stood in the doorway as tanks rumbled past. Soldiers shouted in Russian, their faces hard but human. One of them raised his weapon when he saw Karl's uniform. Karl raised his hand slowly. "I'm done," he said in German. "No more fighting." The soldier hesitated, then lowered his gun. He gestured for Karl to move aside. As the column passed, Karl felt an immense emptiness. The war was over, though no one had said the words yet. Later that day, he wandered to what had once been Tempelhof Airfield. It was unrecognizable. Craters, burnt wrecks, silence. The last Messerschmitts lay twisted like dead birds. He walked to the center of the runway and looked up. For the first time in years, the sky was empty. No planes, no smoke, just a pale, endless blue. He fell to his knees, tears cutting through the soot on his face. "It's over," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew something else. The war would never leave him. The sky, once his sanctuary, had become a graveyard.
He took the letter from his jacket, the one from Anna. It was worn, the ink faded. "Come home when this madness ends." He folded it carefully, placed it on the ground, and whispered, "I'm coming." He began walking south toward the horizon. Behind him, Berlin burned. The road south was quiet. Too quiet. After Berlin, silence felt unnatural, like a wound that refused to close. Karl Adler walked for days, his Luftwaffe jacket torn, his boots bleeding dust. He passed through ghost towns where every window was broken and every church bell lay cracked in the street. The war was over, but no one had told the earth. He met few people, farmers hiding from soldiers, old women who spoke in whispers, children who no longer cried. Germany had been hollowed out, not defeated by bombs or bullets, but by truth. Each night, Karl slept beneath the open sky, listening to the wind. Sometimes he thought he heard the drone of engines, phantom echoes from the life he had lived. Once he dreamed of flying again, not in war, but in peace, soaring above fields of green. When he woke, he wept. By May 10th, he reached a small Bavarian village nestled between the hills. The war had barely touched it. Chickens wandered freely in the streets. The church still stood. Life, impossibly, continued. An old man saw him from a doorway. "Soldier?" he asked cautiously. "Was," Karl said, "no more." The man studied him, then nodded. "Come in. You look hungry." Inside, the house smelled of bread and smoke. The man's wife poured him soup without a word. Karl ate slowly, tasting something other than ash for the first time in months. "Where are you headed?" the man asked. "South, to find my wife, Anna Adler. She was sent to Garmisch. The Americans are there now, but maybe she's safe." Karl nodded. Maybe. He slept that night in their barn. Rain fell softly on the roof. For the first time in years, there were no gunshots, no sirens, just the quiet rhythm of water. He thought of Anna again, her laughter, her music, her hands. He imagined her sitting by a window, waiting. The next morning, he set off again. As he walked through the countryside, he saw the remnants of armies scattered like broken toys, burned trucks, abandoned helmets, graves marked with wooden crosses. In one field, a young soldier, barely 17, sat beside the wreck of a panzer, staring into nothing. Karl stopped. "You should go home," he said. The boy looked up, eyes empty. "Where's that?" Karl had no answer. He walked on. By May 15th, he reached Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The mountains loomed white and silent, untouched by the chaos below. American soldiers patrolled the streets, their jeeps splashing through puddles.
German civilians moved quietly, eyes lowered. Karl felt invisible among them. He found the address Anna had written months earlier, a small boarding house near the river. The owner, a kind-faced woman, looked at him with pity when he asked.
Anna Adler? She repeated. Yes, she stayed here, but she left last week with a Red Cross group, heading toward Innsbruck. Karl's heart clenched. She's alive? The woman smiled faintly. Yes, she spoke of her husband often, said he would come home from the war. Karl swallowed hard. Thank you. That night, he stood by the river, watching the current carry away the last ashes of winter. The water reminded him of the sky, always moving, never resting. He felt both peace and pain. He could go after her tomorrow, he thought, cross into Austria, find her, begin again. But when he looked at his reflection in the dark water, he saw not a man, but a shadow. The uniform, the insignia, the hands that had fired, the eyes that had watched cities burn. How could she ever look at him the same? He sat on the riverbank until dawn. Birds sang. The world went on. For the next few days, he worked with the villagers, helping to clear debris, mend fences, and bury the dead. He spoke little. He didn't tell them who he had been. To them, he was just another displaced man in a country of ruins. One afternoon, while repairing a roof, he heard the sound of an engine overhead. His heart leapt instinctively. He looked up. An American reconnaissance plane circled lazily in the blue sky. He watched it until it disappeared behind the clouds. The sound faded, but something inside him stirred. Not pride, not fear, but longing. That night, he took out Anna's letter again. The paper was worn thin, edges crumbling. He read it slowly, by the light of a lantern. My dearest Karl, the world has gone mad, but somewhere beyond this madness, there must still be a place for us. Come home when it ends. Please, I will wait for you. He folded it carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. He whispered into the dark, soon. But he didn't go to Innsbruck the next day, or the next. Something kept him in Garmisch, perhaps guilt, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps both. He helped rebuild the town. He repaired bicycles for children. He fixed the church bell so it could ring again. Each time it did, it felt like penance. Weeks passed. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sunset bleed across the mountains, a jeep stopped on the road. A woman stepped out, brown hair, tired eyes, a Red Cross armband. Karl froze. Anna, he whispered. She turned, eyes widening. Karl. For a moment, neither moved. Then she ran to him. He caught her in his arms, and for the first time since the war began, he felt something alive inside him. Not duty, not fear, but love.
They held each other for a long time, the mountains silent witnesses to their reunion. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. They said you were dead. I was, Karl said softly, but the sky wouldn't let me go. They sat by the river as the evening deepened. She told him about her journey south, about hiding during air raids, about the children she cared for as a nurse. He told her almost nothing of the war. There were no words for it. When she asked, "Did you fight to the end?" he only said, "I flew until there was nothing left to fly for." She took his hand. Then it's over now. He wanted to believe her. Over the following months, they lived quietly in the village. Karl avoided questions about his past.
The locals knew him only as a quiet craftsman who fixed tools and mended roofs. Anna worked at a small clinic. Life, fragile but real, began to grow again. Sometimes at night, Carl would stand outside and look at the stars. The sky was peaceful again, but he could still hear echoes, engines, gunfire, the voices of friends long gone. He didn't try to forget them. He simply carried them with him. One evening, a young boy approached him holding a carved wooden airplane. "Can you make it fly, Herr Adler?" he asked.
Carl smiled faintly. "Not this one," he said, smoothing the boy's hair. "But maybe one day we'll all learn how to fly again, without war." The boy grinned and ran off. Carl watched him go, the laughter fading into the twilight. Years later, when Germany began to rebuild, Carl never returned to the military. He became a glider instructor in the Alps, teaching young men and women to love the sky, not to fight in it. He told them, "The sky remembers everything, every plane that fell, every soul that rose. But it also forgives, if you learn to listen." And when the wind was right, he would sometimes imagine that he could still hear the faint hum of his old Messerschmitt, not as a weapon, but as a memory. He would close his eyes, feel the air rush past, and whisper into the open blue, "For those who flew and never came home, the sky keeps your names." Then he'd open them again, smile at the horizon, and live another day. The end.